We lost our understanding of why the U.S. was a central pillar of the international order coming out of the Second World War. We lost that generation of knowledge and understanding of what the costs, the catastrophic losses of when an international order collapses, and the loss of 65 million globally. You don't want that. But we're going to have to very painfully learn those lessons.
Hi, I'm James Heapy and welcome back to Superpowers. Today I'm joined by Heather Conley, formerly the President of the German Marshall Fund and also the Assistant Secretary of State in the State Department under George W. Bush, responsible for the United States bilateral relations with Northern and Central Europe. Heather, welcome. This is a really fascinating time to be chatting with someone who is so expert on the United States relationship with Europe, because on this side of the pond, all of our normal reference points seem to be getting deleted right in front of us, and even sort of arch Atlanticists like me are sort of struggling to talk to colleagues and friends around Europe and explain to them the value of our relationship with the United States and why we should sort of stick by the US when they seem so intent on not sticking by us. So Heather, help our viewers to understand, firstly, if you would, what is it that is driving Trump and those around him to take such a hard line in their approach to Europe, not just on security, but on everything? I mean, we've seen Vance criticize Europe around free speech and the way that we run our democracies. We've seen an intervention on Ukraine that is at odds with what many European leaders would have wanted to see. What's going on? What's driving it?
Well, James, it's always great to be with you. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. And you're absolutely right. What we are all witnessing is an extraordinary moment of history where the international system that we have understood for the past 80 years is ending. And I mean, the United States was the key pillar of creating that post-World War II international system. It's now recreating it in a very, very different way. And I think people, this is what keeps us also, our understanding for 80 years is now gone. And I think we're trying to grab onto new understandings, and I can get back to that in a second. So what is the Trump administration trying to do? Well, President Trump himself, he has sort of three lenses, I think, and this has been consistent. He has said this consistently since the 1980s, so there's nothing new here. What new is the focused implementation of it. He has always believed about trade deficits and tariffs from the 1980s. He believes that allies simply take advantage of the United States. He sees no benefit in those alliances. And I think the third, this is where the United States, he views the United States as a victim. And that is never how we've portrayed ourselves as a victim. So it's a historical grievance. And so all of those are manifesting itself right now. And I think, again, this administration, one cannot evaluate it from what we understood from the first term, very transactional, using that leverage that we see in tariffs. This administration is about reorganizing the international system, the economic order, as well as the security order, and they're going about it. It's very messy. It's inconsistent, but I think there is some underneath President Trump are using this moment to make that change. And I just want people to understand it's systemic. It's designed to, whether it achieves or not, totally different. And that's making our allies who've relied on this 80-year system, it's having them completely disoriented about how they should behave. Should they defend this system by themselves? This is what Europe's expressing itself. I'm going to be the one standing here to defend this system. Or is that system now in such a state of collapse that really Europe's energies needs to be focused now on building the new system? And I think that's the great challenge before the transatlantic community.
It's fascinating. We have a truly transatlantic viewership of superpowers. And when you read through the comments after each episode posted, you see plenty that support Trump in his approach and believe that Europe needs to be, have the mirror held up and sort of forced to consider its priorities. But plenty of other Americans who say, whoa, this is sort of, this just isn't what America's role in the world should be. Now, I know that through your work with the German Marshall Fund, you spend a lot of time engaging with American communities, talking about the value of the transatlantic relationship. Which of the two views we see expressed in our comments is the majority view in the US right now?
I think I hear both, and so your readership is exactly the viewership is exactly that mirror, and the challenge here is, look, there is absolute truth in what President Trump and the Trump administration has put forward. This crisis of European defense spending, this has been building for decades, And in some ways, for those of us who are true champions of the transatlantic community, it just, for me, it frustrates me that what propelled Europe, ultimately the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine of 2022, but it took this to get Europe to do this. So that's the frustration. The frustration is, why haven't we had a new transatlantic economic relationship? Why did the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership never work out? We're the most powerful trade investment bloc in the world, but we got in our own way. And so instead of solving problems, reforming institutions, we allowed them to slide, and then they fall into irresponsible hands and not managing that reform. So there is truth, and our allies do need to do more. But then there's not the recognition that the United States receives great benefit from those allies. So that's my frustration. The United States, and this is when I go out and through our whistle stop tours, what you encounter are Americans very frustrated, and they don't understand the value of alliances. No one's told them. So what they've been hearing a steady diet of over the last 8 years is, you've been ripped off. And so they're shaking their head going, we've been ripped off, because no one has been explaining and showing them the connectivity between their economic security and their security. The story is there, and it's a powerful story, and they are excited about that story. But if you don't hear it and you only hear one side, you start vibrating to the other side. But you're absolutely right. There are core values that, and I believe in the John McCain, our values are our interests are our values approach. Freedom, sovereignty, security. The American people understand those terms very, very deeply. So when you speak about those, they understand them. But again, if there's no connectivity, if they don't understand that their freedom is connected to Ukraine's freedom, they don't understand how that works, they're not going to believe that. An informed public has to be part of an informed public policy, as Thomas Jefferson said. So it's both. And so this is a fight, really, for what the American people believe in, what they want to support. And it will be very interesting to see eventually how they respond.
But it plays out in a very different way, I think, to the Cold War. I mean, firstly, there is a divide in the US, as we've spoken about from what's reflected in our comments and you experience as you go around the US in your line of work. But this is actually bipartisan. It's not that Dems are internationalist, Republicans are isolationists. There is an internationalist version of America, there is an isolationist version of America on both sides of the aisle. But then also, in the Cold War, everything about American culture was about the promotion of freedom, of capitalism, of free market economies, and a belief that the world would be better the more and more of it that adopted the US approach to conducting its affairs. I think the thing that perplexes me the most is that there is a challenge to our values, our ideology, every bit as severe now as arguably during the latter stages of the Cold War, and yet America and Americans no longer seem so assertive about themselves internationally. So, what causes that? Why has America decided no longer to try to shape the world and just to sort of hunker down and look after itself?
Oh, James, we could have an entire seminar on this. It's such a great question. Thank you. I mean, I think, again, part of the confusion for America's role in the world comes in the post-Cold War environment. We never created our own understanding of what our power was for. And again, this is not a Cold War era. We sort of muscle flex back to it because it has some elements of it. But remember, this was where, coming out of the sacrifices of the Second World War, American generation of leaders, that greatest generation, understood the devastation, understood what's at stake, and there was a continuity of American leadership that understood that the United States outward expression was actually protecting it from protecting its security and enhancing its economic strength. That generation moved, and another generation came forward, which felt there's more that isolationism, that retrenchment, and you're absolutely right, left and right meet on that. And the internationalists and those that were upholding that order began to shrink. The center was not holding politically or internationally. You also combine that with, the United States has not won a war over the last 20 years. We did not win Afghanistan. It was a humiliating withdrawal. We did not win Iraq. It was sort of an unsatisfactory withdrawal. So the international engagement was failing, and then concurrent to that, domestically, the financial crisis, the surge in migration, the domestic was failing. And I mean, all of this happened in Europe as well. So we are shared by that. So now the center's narrative failed, proof. Now this is where a very new narrative and a new attack on the international system. So this is where my surprise has been how much the United States' role in the world depended on a series of leaders accepting a normative framework of why that international system that it created was its benefit. That's out the door. And now we have leadership, young and old, that are challenging that system profoundly. And I think that's happening in Europe as well, to a lesser extent. But that's what's, I think, the dynamic here.
Heather, even if the US public are willing to deny the connection in values that exist between the US and Europe, and to see Europe as having sort of strayed from the path of freedom, which I think is what Vance said when he came to Paris. I paraphrase, but broadly. And even worse, Americans are willing to accept hearing their president and those around him talk about Putin and Russia in a way that, to European ears, appears to deny the facts. It seems that when the US public think about China, there is still a sort of sense of purpose and America the Great, and a competition in values. So am I misunderstanding, or is there this odd cognitive dissonance when looking towards the Atlantic, it's isolationist, leave that all behind, park Putin, but when looking towards the Pacific, it is every bit the competition of superpowers, competition of values, competition over a world order that is much more familiar from the 70s, 80s?
So I think I take it a little differently. I think we are entering an era which is driven by our politics, and I call it it's strongmanism. And you could draw almost a line to some of the statements that, in the lead up to the referendum on Brexit. Take control. The world seems out of control. Migration, the economics, security. I want someone who will control. I want a strong leader. And Mr. Trump represents that strong leader who's willing to tackle all this stuff that no one ever tackles, and seeking that change. So that's sort of and this is where I think, and it's a longer conversation, that's why Mr. Trump so deeply admires Mr. Putin, Mr. Xi. They're geniuses. They get their way. They can control things. No one questions their power. And I think there's just an affinity for that strong man approach as Mr. Trump embodies. The China question is you're absolutely right. So I think Mr. Trump and some around him, it is the admiration of the strong man. For Mr. Putin, it goes a little deeper in the evangelical community, the decadence of the West. It also speaks to sort of this economic dominance, if you will, and natural resources. China, it's challenging because, the one hand, yes, super hawks on both the Republican and the Democratic Party, but you have Mr. Trump going in very different ways. TikTok, there was universal support to ban TikTok. What happened? Mr. Trump overturned that because of the need to reach social media audiences. So there's not a consistency here at all. Mr. Trump has expressed a desire that he wants to meet with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping to talk about arms control. So the three strongmen coming together to talk about how to make the world more stable, more peaceful. And at the same time, you have an administration that's deeply concerned about China. Yet you had Bridge Colby, who is nominated to be Undersecretary of Defense, say that Taiwan is not existential to the United States or the defense of Taiwan. So there's lots of ambiguity. And in many ways, I think the danger with the U.S.-China relationship is both sides see that the other is weak domestically, and that is not the case. And so that is what concerns me the most. So, as I said, I think we've got to think about how this international system is rapidly transforming, how it will transform. Will this be a sphere of influence, balance of power? The ceasefire and what Mr. Trump agrees with Vladimir Putin will, I think, tell us volumes about the type of world we'll evolve into for the United States, and then how Europe decides to either uphold that 80-year system and try to defend it until it comes back, or it's holding on to something that's rapidly diminishing.
Expand on that for me then, Heather, because I've been very struck in my time as a British minister on my visits to the Hill that Zelensky was not the unquestioned hero on the Hill as he was in Westminster and Paris and Berlin and European capitals. So there's always been a slightly different emotion around the Ukraine war. If this ends up as a sort of quite a grubby peace settlement where the Ukrainians feel deeply aggrieved, Europe ends up enforcing a peace that it had little to do with designing, and the real sort of guarantee that it all pivots on is around these rare earth minerals and US rights to them. Does that just end up being seen in the United States as a great grand strategic success for the US because they've parked a war, secured access to critical minerals, which are really important in their competition with China, and from a US grand strategic perspective, that's all that matters? Or actually, are there some who will start to see that the security of Europe and an unsecurable peace in Europe challenges the US interest too?
So you're absolutely right. Ukraine has become so embroiled in our domestic politics, and this goes back to 2016 and 2019 with the impeachment. There is way too much politics domestically in the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship. But I will say, in the United States, when the full-scale invasion happened, you saw all the Ukrainian flags flying. People understood. This is what understand. The American people understand very strongly what is right and what is wrong. They're just not getting the rationale to say this is why we need to invest. This is what at stake. This is what will impact the United States. We lost an opportunity 3 years ago to explain and sustain. As long as it takes does not explain and extend, the investment in the strategic imperative. So there's a lot of blame to go around on how we really lost that important strategic narrative. But I do agree with you. Look, the U.S. Ukraine critical minerals deal, in the minds of the president and his closest advisors, that's just paying for what we've provided. Again, that gets back to, as I said, the United States is the victim and it was ripped off. It's now getting paid back. So at least we've been made whole. And that's what obviously upset the Ukrainian government so much. It was, well, where is this? I'm giving some of my future away, my future wealth away. Where's the future? There was no future. That was for back taxes. And so this is where I agree with you. It will be heralded as a great strategic decision to bring peace, to get the U.S. sort of made whole. Now, we understand this isn't going to hold. This peace is just an opportunity for Russia to reconstitute militarily, continue to secure its gains, and it will be wholly unstable. The question is whether that instability will fall into this second term for the president, of course, who prides himself as no one dares to fight a war while he is president. Well, will that hold? But no, this makes it wholly unstable. But yes, the rationale, and you're hearing the rationale even for China, that this is to try to break China away, the U.S.-Russia relationship, which any of us who study the Sino-Russian relationship, this is not going to happen, but they will tell themselves that. And so, yes, there's a strategic rationale for it.
The thing I find baffling is in very recent memory, there is an example of President Trump doing something that he thought was expedient, the signing up for the end of all the US involvement to Afghanistan, the Doha deal, blamed all of his democratic predecessors for the mismanagement of that war. And then, of course, the withdrawal from Kabul, and you mentioned it earlier on as an example of US failure in recent years, but the withdrawal from Kabul and all the chaos that accompanied it was the consequence of the Doha agreement that Trump had signed in his first presidency. And I find it amazing that so little is made of that parallel, because it feels awfully like what's going on with Ukraine right now, that there's a political win for Trump that only has to hold for another 3.5 years and then legacy secure. But if in 8 or 9 years' time, the US interests across Europe are hideously damaged because war breaks out again, that'll be somebody else's problem by then. But that just doesn't feel like the way that the leader of the free world normally operates.
Well, as I said, again, this long-term consequence, the second and third order effect, is not part of the calculation. It's securing the win. It's an incredible public narrative that is around that win, and the other things are someone else's fault and concern. And it's been a very successful posture. Whether it will hold, and this is where America's adversaries see the internal challenges in the U.S. and our distraction. I can't imagine they would not take advantage of that in the next 3.5 years, or reach their own grand bargains to secure what is in their interest. And again, all of this will be done in the name of peace and stability.
What, Heather, a more immediate consequence of Trump's foreign and trade policy is the impact of tariffs. We're recording Friday afternoon in the UK, Friday morning in the US. Mark Carney will become the Canadian Prime Minister Premier within the next few hours. The EU last week started to show some of its teeth around how it would respond to US tariffs. If the international economy reacts in the way that most economists predict that it will, and that the damage to the US is not something like, I think Trump has disguised it as short-term necessary pain, but if it turns out to be more than that, what happens then? Do the US public start to become critical and change their minds, or does Trump manage to persuade them that this is all the doing of others?
Well, you're definitely seeing, whether it's Ukraine and the war, whether it's Canada, you are seeing the implications of whether you bend to the American will or whether you resist the American will. And again, strongman tactics on display. Well, right now, the short answer to your question, James, we don't know. Right now, we are definitely hearing a description, and this is where I think people thought that this highly transactional president would use leverage, get something out of it, turn around and say, see, I got something out of it, and now I'll stop. That was first term. Second term is, again, the public justification. Yep, maybe we'll have a little recession. Yep, this is going to be painful, but it's pain for a new system because the old system was ripping you off. The new system will reindustrialize the United States. We are changing the system, and yes, there's a little pain that will impact that. Now, I think that will be the current description. How long this goes and whether the U.S. slides into a recession. The tariffs, the counter tariffs, are certainly designed to hurt the president's party politically in key areas. We certainly know Republicans are hearing it. Their constituents are telling them about it. People that voted for Mr. Trump, whether it's a veteran that used to work in the U.S. government that's just gotten fired or farmers that are really hitting this, they're hearing about it, but it's not altering them for right now. So their justification is the pain is worth the change. And we'll see how long that holds. I think we just don't know that. And right now, the major U.S. corporations are publicly saying, I get it. Privately, I think obviously hoping that their greater certainty is ahead. But I think we're part of the I accept the pain and you will accept it too. And the president may have enough political support and he certainly has Congress, the Republicans are able to manage that. He may be able to sustain this for quite some time.
I'm going to flip the tone of my questions a bit because, I focus very much on how the US views its relationships with the rest of the world, and I've not even tried to conceal my concern and disbelief really at the way that a lot of what's happening is being done. The other way round, how should Europe, how should the UK, Japan, Australia, how should we engage the US? How do we make ourselves relevant to a US audience?
Gosh, I've thought a lot about this, and what's been challenging here in Washington is that we have sort of tried to give advice to our European friends, do this, do that, try to do this, and it's wholly unsatisfactory because obviously what influences the president is something very, very different. What I think Europe and our other allies should do is continue to strengthen themselves economically, through competitiveness, and continue to increase their defense spending and security. It's not for the United States. It's absolutely for themselves. Meanwhile, as privately as they can, continue to work with those in the administration that are continuing to strengthen the intelligence ties, the military ties, the security ties. That will buy time for you to continue to strengthen yourselves. And in that way, we want strong American allies because the security environment right now is absolutely going to demand it. But I think the best way you manage this period is to strengthen yourselves, strengthen your unity, and hope there's enough time for you to get there. What concerns me is, and we've talked about this, Europe has been so delayed in increasing its defense spending. The timelines don't match here, and this is my concern. It will take a decade. You tell me, you're the expert, I'm not, for Europe to have the defense production capabilities and to try to build its own European pillar within NATO. And it's going to be incredibly painful to do it separately. I hope that's not the case. I hope the U.S. remains engaged and integrated into that European defense pillar. But if not, if the changes happen so quickly and dramatically, Europe can try, but I'm worried it's not enough because it hasn't strengthened itself competitiveness and in security and defense. So that's not great advice because I don't know what those timelines are. But what Europe needs to do is just keep accelerating its economic strength, its military strength, and hope it can manage this transition period as best it can.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and you're also right to identify that Europe needs to be demonstrably paying its way for its own security, visibly strengthening itself. And it would also be very fair to say that the fact that for so many the starting gun has only just been fired on this is in justification for the approach that Trump has taken, because the starting gun should have fired 5 or 10 years ago. And the fact that it will now take 10 years for Europe to properly get into gear on its rearming probably won't hold a ton of sway in the White House when this all started with the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. And so
Exactly.
and
The gun went off in 2014. It's been over a decade. So that was a lost decade. James, what for me, which is, and I would love to do some research on this, is starting to calculate though the cost of the U.S. position, because trust has now been profoundly broken. And we're watching that in Ukraine. We can stop intelligence sharing. We can stop this when we want to. And so there will never be this high level of dependency on the United States. And I would love your reaction to this. How do you like this guest is asking you questions instead of you asking me? The arrogance of it. In many ways, our allies built up this dependence, and we encouraged it because that dependency allowed us to very much control how things worked. But it came at a great cost, a cost that now the United States does not want to bear anymore. But never more will there be that dependency. So this is going to be a huge loss to the United States. Not only our defense contractors that have wholly benefited from the last 3 years, particularly after the full-scale invasion, now things are going to be built separately. This is going to be a great loss. So I said there was cost to America's creating this dependency and our allies leaning into the dependency. There's going to be a cost that we haven't begun to calculate when our allies start building individual systems or with other allies that keep us excluded.
Well, I mean, I can pick up on your question and then build on it. I think that is definitely what will happen. I think that, to just take the sort of the geopolitical first, if the consequence of this episode in international affairs is that the conclusion that is made is that the West, and specifically the United States, is an unreliable partner, that has profound consequence for the way that global affairs are run and that the world is ordered. And what's more, it is a reinforcement of the BRICS narrative. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in putting together this group, they've sort of said that, who are the West to say how the world should be run? They've designed an international system that is to their advantage. There should be a way of doing global affairs that is more transactional, more nakedly in the national self-interest. And the reason to cooperate is simply because those national interests align. There is no greater, higher purpose than that. And I really worry that this episode in US diplomacy will say to all of the countries around the world who for decades have aspired to be the friend of the United States and have as a consequence sought to show their fealty by taking contracts with US corporates, that actually they will just say, well, look, the US won't come for us in our hour of need. And maybe we are better having the transactional relationship with China or Russia instead. And that is incredibly worrying to me. But the thing that bothers me every bit as much is if the US now goes into a period of self-imposed isolationism, reduces or even removes its interest from the establishment of a wider global order and doesn't seek to compete with China in shaping the way that global affairs are governed over the next century. When the US realizes that it does need to re-engage, it will re-engage with a system that is fundamentally changed and no longer operates in the interests of a liberal democratic free market United States. And Heather, I wonder, if that is something that is being discussed in any way in the US, that isolationism brings with it a cost in 10, 20 years' time.
So, what is that great adage? You only understand the value of something when you lose it. And I fear that we are going to have a very painful experience and the lesson of the loss exactly of that. And that goes back to my original. We lost our understanding of why the US was a central pillar of the international order coming out of the Second World War. We lost that generation of knowledge and understanding of what the costs, the catastrophic losses of when an international order collapses, and the loss of 65 million globally. You don't want that. But we're going to have to very painfully learn those lessons. Now, I think you will still have competing with China, the United States competing with China as a defining feature of this new system, but will there be regional limitations to that? So we will fight China in our hemisphere. So that's the Panama Canal contretemps. You can see that even in Greenland a little bit with China's desire for infrastructure and critical minerals. Will it become hemispheric, or will we continue to sort of globally try to compete, whether that's in Africa? Is it more, rather than competing with China specifically, it's about competing for critical minerals and energy dominance, so in technology, that those are the factors, those are the planes of competition rather than regional. That's the question. But as I said, the unreliability of the U.S. economically, and again, this is a two-part shift. It's a change in the economic order, and it's a change in the security order potentially. But again, James, for 80 years, that system is sticky. and people, as you said in the beginning, there's going to be one foot in that system, fighting for that system. And then there's going to be what we see now, emerging a new system, but we're not quite sure who's going to dominate it. Will it be, these new axes? So Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. You sort of have Europe and Australia and Japan as sort of one cone. You have the U.S. sort of doing its own thing. And then, of course, you have other actors that are going to be fluid with all of those groups and benefiting potentially from this transition. We simply don't know that. This is what I mean. This is what's so historic about this moment, because we are witnessing a new international system begin to form. It's just not clear. It's the old, it's the new, and there are many, many new actors that are shaping that from the private sector and tech and things like that. So it's frightening from a scholarship perspective. You're watching it, you're trying to assess it and understand it. But I think, again, America is going to learn some very powerful lessons, painful, and some will be, okay, we didn't need to do that. So we aren't going to continue to do that. We will learn many lessons, and it's going to be exceptionally painful for our allies and for the United States.
Heather, it's fascinating. And I wonder if, as we reach the end of our conversation, I can just ask you to reflect a bit, because what strikes me when I think about the relationships you managed in the State Department in the early part of this century, when America was attacked on its own soil and coalitions of the willing were built to deal with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and then to get after Al-Qaeda and other purposes in Iraq. And I know that there were European capitals that will have really annoyed you in being so uncertain about their response. But the majority of European capitals were full square behind the United States throughout. Can you believe that we've gone from where the administration that you served in the early 2000s to what we're seeing now with J.D. Vance and others talking about Europe in the way that they are? Is it mendable?
Well, and the 9/11 reflection, that was my first day at the State Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, was the day after 9/11. It was a very powerful moment. And I saw all the exceptional goodwill come forth, and our European colleagues went to war in support of us, even when they didn't see necessarily the direct connection to their own security interest. They did that because the United States was the bulwark of the international system, and their security depended on us. And you're absolutely right. But again, those memories have dissipated. Americans don't remember that the first time that NATO ever declared an Article 5 was in defense of the United States. They think it's just Europeans ripping off the United States. And so this is what I mean, the tragedy of all of this, and I would say this is the great Secretary of State George Shultz saying, we didn't tend our own garden. We didn't tend the American people's garden of understanding and making sure that they fully supported the approach that we are taking and the why. Is it mendable? My father would say, trust is like a vase, and when it breaks, you can glue it back together again, but it will never be as strong as it was before it broke. And I think that, to me, I think we have to focus, James, on building the future together and building a more durable future. As we talked about, the dependencies were not durable. So I think I'd like to focus on the mending. If there is to be and a group of people, transatlanticists need to begin to build those new foundations based on those values, but they're going to have to do it in a new way. And we're going to have to do a much better job of explaining to our publics who believe that the last 20 years has only meant failure by government leaders, not success. We have to rebuild trust with them too. And they have to, and the American and people and our European colleagues and citizens need to understand. And I think there's a little more understanding in Europe because they understood they were devastated by the Second World War. America wasn't. Pearl Harbor, yes, but we had not experienced war on our soil, which is why we are outward facing to prevent that from happening. 9/11 was a stark example of where it can, no isolationist, no ocean can protect us purely. But we've got to now mend and think about who's rebuilding, because it's not just the next president. If that happens, and it may not happen, we may be in a prolonged period here. And I think people also need to understand, this is just 4 years. It may not be. We have to have some bipartisanship around those building blocks. And we lost that. We lost bipartisanship in foreign and security policy. So lots of mending that needs to be done within the United States, first and foremost, to get an understanding of the best use of American power and investments. And then our allies need to see that we are stable and reliable. And no matter if it's a Republican or a Democratic president or an independent, that there's some values that they hold and they have that certainty. We are far from that today.
Heather, it's been a fascinating conversation, sobering, but the clarity that you bring to sort of untangling American politics for Europeans and the work that you do in trying to explain the value of Europe to Americans makes you the perfect guest to have at a time like this. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like more geopolitical commentary and analysis like this, then please tune in for further episodes of Superpowers, or indeed the wider geopolitical commentary that is provided on the Times Radio YouTube channel. You can subscribe to that by clicking on the link below. For now, I'm James Heapy. This is Superpowers, the future of global security on Times Radio. Thanks for watching.